Rachel Hartman buried her father on a Tuesday in March, and by the following Monday, she was already back at her desk because no one in her family had ever taught her how to stop and grieve out loud. Years later, looking back on everything that followed that quiet, unremarkable Monday, she understood it as the exact moment the rest of the story had quietly begun. Though nothing about that ordinary morning at her desk had felt like the beginning of anything at the time. She didn't know yet that grief wasn't the only thing she'd be burying that year. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 11 years of marriage. A business she helped build from a single workshop into something with a real name in the region. And a folder of paperwork she was never supposed to see that would end up telling her more about her own life than her husband ever had. This is the story of a woman who spent over a decade being the quiet, steady presence behind two men's success and who had no idea, until the year she lost her father, exactly how much of herself she had let disappear into that role. What started as a private grief became something much larger once she began noticing the small ways she had already been pushed to the edges of a life she thought she still fully belonged to. This is a story about what it costs a woman to keep holding everything together while everyone around her quietly stops seeing her as anything other than the person who holds things together. Rachel Hartman was 34 years old the spring her father, Frank Combs, passed away after a short illness that gave the family barely 6 weeks to prepare for something none of them were ever truly going to be ready for. She had been the one who handled the hospice calls, who sat with him most afternoons while her two brothers found reasons to visit less and less often as the weeks wore on, who planned the funeral almost entirely on her own while still managing the books for Hartman and Voss Custom Furniture, the woodworking business her husband, Thomas, ran alongside his best friend since childhood, Preston Voss, a partnership that had once, in its earliest years, felt like the steadiest thing in either of their lives. The company had been started by Thomas's father, Walter Hartman, in a converted barn just outside Nashville, building custom cabinetry and furniture pieces for a small handful of loyal clients before Thomas and Preston eventually took it over and grew it into something considerably larger. A full workshop with 8 employees and a reputation solid enough that clients waited months for a commission. Rachel had joined the business early in her marriage to Thomas, taking over the invoicing and client scheduling when the company was still small enough that hiring outside help felt unnecessary, and over 11 years. She had built the administrative backbone of a company that Thomas and Preston were generally credited with building, a distinction that had never bothered her before the spring everything else in her life began quietly falling apart at the same time. The grief itself came in waves Rachel had not expected, arriving hardest not during the funeral, which she got through with the same steady composure she brought to everything, but in the weeks afterward. In ordinary moments like reaching for her phone to call her father with a small piece of news before remembering, again, that there was no longer anyone on the other end of that number. She did not talk about this much with Thomas, not because he had ever told her not to, but because somewhere over the past several years, without either of them ever deciding it outright, Rachel had stopped bringing her heavier feelings to her marriage at all. Thomas had grown quieter over that same stretch of time, more absorbed in the business, more prone to short, distracted answers at dinner, and Rachel had absorbed that shift the same way she absorbed most things, without complaint. Assuming it was simply what marriage looked like after over a decade together, two people settling into separate orbits that still technically shared the same house. She had met Thomas when she was 22, waiting tables at a restaurant near the workshop where Walter Hartman still came in most mornings for coffee before his son took over the daily operations. Thomas had been easy to fall for in those early years, patient in a way that felt steady rather than dull, someone who asked real questions and seemed to actually listen to her answers. And Rachel remembered clearly the first time he brought her to the barn workshop to show her a chest of drawers he had built entirely by hand, the pride in his voice when he ran his palm along a joint he had cut without a single visible seam. She married him 2 years later, and when Walter passed away not long after, Leaving the business to Thomas and Preston together, Rachel stepped into the bookkeeping role without a second thought, glad to have a way to contribute to something that mattered so clearly to the man she loved. For years, that arrangement felt like a genuine partnership, Rachel handling the invoices and the client calendar with the same careful precision her own mother had once brought to running a household on very little money, while Thomas and Preston built furniture and relationships with clients who kept coming back and referring their friends. Somewhere around year 7 or 8, though Rachel could never afterward pin down the exact point it began, something in the rhythm of the marriage had shifted. Thomas started making decisions about the business without running them past her first. Small things at first, a new supplier, a shift in pricing, and then larger things. A decision to take on a much bigger commission that strained the workshop's capacity for months without Rachel hearing about it until the schedule was already set. When she asked why she hadn't been included in the conversation, Thomas would tell her it was a Preston and Thomas decision, an ownership matter rather than a bookkeeping matter. A distinction that had never existed in quite that form during the earlier years of their marriage. Rachel noticed the shift and said very little about it at the time, telling herself that businesses naturally evolved, that as the company grew, certain decisions simply moved further up the chain, even though she was the one who still reconciled every dollar that moved through it. She did not yet call this what it eventually became easier to name much later, the slow erosion of her place in something she had spent over a decade helping to build. By the time her father grew sick, Rachel had already grown accustomed to feeling like a background presence in her own life, competent and necessary, but rarely consulted, valued for what she managed rather than for anything she might think or want herself. She did not resent this openly, mostly because she had never articulated it clearly enough, even to herself, to recognize it as something worth resenting. It simply felt like the shape her adult life had taken, a shape she had grown into gradually enough that she rarely noticed how much smaller it had become around her, and it was only in the raw, unguarded weeks after burying her father, when she found herself with no outlet for the size of what she was feeling, that the smallness of everything else in her life became impossible to keep ignoring. The first thing Rachel actually noticed, rather than simply felt, came about 5 weeks after the funeral, on an evening when she had hoped Thomas might sit with her a little longer than usual after dinner. Since the anniversary of her parents' wedding had passed that week and she found herself missing her father more sharply than she had in days. Thomas told her he needed to head back to the workshop for a few hours to finish measurements on a commission piece, something that had happened occasionally before but never quite this often, and Rachel sat alone in the kitchen afterward, turning over a small, specific detail she hadn't let herself examine too closely until that moment. Over the preceding month, Thomas had begun taking his phone into the bathroom when he showered in the mornings, a habit that had never existed before. And he had started keeping it face down on the nightstand rather than leaving it wherever he happened to set it the way he always had. None of it, on its own, meant anything definite. Rachel knew that. She also knew, in the same quiet, competent way she knew when an invoice didn't add up before she had even finished checking the math, that something in the rhythm of her marriage had shifted again, and this time it did not feel like ordinary drift. A week later, dropping off lunch at the workshop on an afternoon she hadn't planned in advance, Rachel walked in to find Thomas and Preston in the small back office with the door mostly closed. A scatter of paperwork on the desk between them that did not resemble any client order form or commission contract she recognized from 11 years of handling exactly that kind of paperwork herself. Thomas looked up when she knocked, and something crossed his face for half a second before he smiled and thanked her for the lunch, sliding the papers into a folder with a motion so smooth it barely registered as deliberate. Preston greeted her with his usual easy warmth, the same friendly familiarity he had always shown her since she and Thomas first started dating, and neither of them offered any explanation for what she had seen, and she did not ask for one. Telling herself in the moment that it was probably nothing, ownership paperwork or supplier contracts, the kind of thing that had increasingly become a Thomas and Preston matter rather than something that needed her attention. She drove home unsettled in a way she could not fully name, aware only that the unease sitting in her chest felt heavier than the moment itself seemed to justify. The same specific heaviness she remembered from the early weeks of her father's illness. Before any doctor had confirmed what her own instincts had already quietly, correctly begun to suspect. The following weeks brought a string of small, disconnected details that Rachel found herself quietly cataloging without ever fully deciding to. A new employee at the workshop, a woman named Erica Doyle who had been hired to manage client consultations a few months earlier, came up in conversation more often than seemed necessary. Thomas mentioning her scheduling instincts or her eye for design at dinner in a way that felt oddly specific for someone he supposedly interacted with only in passing. A dinner Thomas said was with a client ran until nearly 11 at night, later than any client meeting had ever run in 11 years of Rachel keeping the company's calendar. A text notification lit up his phone screen at a stoplight one afternoon while Rachel sat beside him in the passenger seat, a name she didn't recognize followed by a single word she caught only a fragment of before Thomas turned the phone face down against his leg. Rachel said nothing about any of it in the moment it happened, the same instinct that had kept her quiet through years of smaller erosions keeping her quiet now, though this particular silence felt different to her. Less like accommodation and more like something gathering weight underneath the surface of her days. Before we keep going, if you were sitting in Rachel's seat right now, having just noticed all of this while still raw from losing your own father, type 1 if you would have confronted Thomas the moment you saw that phone light up at the stoplight. Or type 2 if you would have done what Rachel did and stayed quiet a little longer to see how much further it went. We will come back to what she actually decided in a moment, but we want to know where you land before the story continues. And if you haven't already, now is a good time to hit that subscribe button, because what Rachel eventually found went a lot further than a phone screen at a stoplight. Rachel did not go looking for proof right away. For nearly 2 weeks after the stoplight, she simply lived alongside her own unease, still managing the household, still reconciling the company's books every evening the way she had for over a decade. Still grieving her father in the small private ways that surfaced when she least expected them, a song on the radio, the smell of a particular aftershave in a hardware store aisle. It was Denise Callahan, an old friend from college who had gone on to become a family law attorney and who Rachel had reconnected with at her father's funeral, who eventually gave her the small nudge she needed. Over coffee one afternoon, Rachel mentioned the stoplight and the closed office door almost in passing, the way a person mentions something they haven't yet let themselves take seriously, and Denise, listening carefully, told her gently that whatever else was happening, Rachel had every right to understand her own financial position clearly, regardless of what she eventually decided to do with that understanding. It was not dramatic advice. It was simply permission, from someone Rachel trusted, to stop assuming she had to wait for someone else to hand her clarity about her own life. Rachel began paying closer attention to the company's financial records that same week, not as a wife hunting for evidence of an affair, but as the bookkeeper she had been for 11 years. Going back through vendor accounts and ownership documents with the same careful eye she brought to every reconciliation, a discipline she had practiced so consistently for so long that even now, unsettled and grieving, her hands moved through the familiar motions of the work almost on their own. Spreadsheets opening, folders sorting themselves into the same categories she had used for over a decade, the one part of her life that still felt entirely steady even while everything else around it had begun quietly shifting beneath her. She found the first irregularity almost immediately once she started looking specifically for it, a set of ownership restructuring documents filed with the state 3 months earlier. Papers she had never been asked to review or sign despite having handled every other piece of the company's paperwork since its earliest years. The filing adjusted the distribution of profit shares in a way that reduced the portion legally tied to Thomas individually and increased Preston's controlling stake, a change that, on paper, looked like an ordinary business decision between two partners. Rachel understood enough about marital property law from her conversations with Denise to recognize what it might actually accomplish. quietly shrinking the portion of the business that could be considered part of the marital estate if a divorce ever became a conversation between her and Thomas, restructured months before any such conversation had ever taken place between them. She sat with that discovery the way she had once sat with a hospice nurse's quiet update about her father's prognosis, absorbing something enormous in complete stillness before allowing herself to react to it at all. She thought back to the closed office door, to the papers Thomas had slid into a folder so smoothly it hadn't registered at the time as deliberate, and understood now, with a clarity that arrived all at once, that whatever Thomas and Preston had been discussing that afternoon had very likely been exactly this. She did not confront him that night or the next. Instead, she began building her own quiet understanding of the full picture the same way she had built every other piece of competence in her life, methodically, at night after Thomas had gone to sleep, cross-referencing every filing, every calendar entry, every dinner that had run later than any client meeting reasonably should, until the outline of something far larger than a single restructuring document began to take shape in front of her. 3 weeks into this quiet review, Rachel found a pattern in the company credit card statements that confirmed what the stoplight and the closed door had already suggested to her. A recurring charge at a small hotel outside the city, always on a weekday afternoon, always billed under a miscellaneous client entertainment category that Rachel herself had created years earlier for legitimate business dinners, now being used to disguise something else entirely. She cross-referenced the dates against Erica Doyle's work schedule, which she still had access to as part of managing payroll, and found that every single hotel charge landed on a day when Erica's calendar showed her leaving the workshop early for what was logged simply as a client site visit, a category of appointment that, as far as Rachel's own record showed, Erica had never actually been assigned to handle in her role managing consultations. Rachel did not need any further confirmation after that. She had spent 11 years building a career out of noticing exactly this kind of pattern, and she was not about to doubt her own eye now simply because the pattern implicated her own marriage instead of someone else's business. A fact she reminded herself of quietly more than once in the days that followed. Rachel brought everything she had found to Denise the following week, laying out the restructuring filing, the hotel charges, the mismatched calendar entries with the same careful, unhurried precision she brought to closing out the company's books at the end of every quarter. Denise listened without interrupting, the way a good attorney does, and when Rachel finished, she asked the same question Rachel had been asking herself in different forms for nearly a month, patiently, without any pressure attached to needing an immediate answer. What did Rachel actually want out of whatever came next? Rachel's answer surprised her a little even as she said it out loud for the first time, because it was not, in the end, primarily about the affair, painful as that discovery had been to sit with. What she wanted most was to understand exactly how much of the business, and by extension how much of her own financial future, had already been quietly moved out of her reach before she ever had the chance to protect it herself. Denise told her, gently but directly, that the restructuring filing alone raised enough questions to warrant a formal forensic review of the company's finances, something Rachel, as an owner's spouse with 11 years of direct involvement in the bookkeeping, had every legal standing to request. Over the following 6 weeks, working alongside a forensic accountant Denise brought in specifically for the review, Rachel helped assemble a fuller picture than she had been able to build alone at her kitchen table late at night. The restructuring filing turned out to be only the first of 2 similar adjustments made over the preceding year, each one shifting slightly more ownership weight toward Preston and away from Thomas, timed closely enough to specific arguments Rachel now remembered having with Thomas about money and distance in her marriage that the pattern felt almost too precise to be coincidental. The forensic accountant also uncovered a small consulting arrangement Preston had quietly set up with a company owned by Erica Doyle's brother, billed against the workshop's marketing budget, payments that appeared to have no clear deliverable attached to them beyond a handful of vague invoices for services that overlapped suspiciously with tasks Erica herself was already being paid to perform in her regular role. It was not a fortune, not in the way Rachel had half expected once she understood the scale of the restructuring, but it confirmed something she had begun to suspect on her own. that Preston was not simply a bystander to whatever Thomas was doing, but an active participant helping to protect both of their interests at Rachel's expense. What struck Rachel most during those 6 weeks was not any single document, but the cumulative sense of having been managed rather than partnered with, decisions made carefully around her rather than with her, over a period of time that, once she saw it laid out clearly, stretched back considerably further than she had originally assumed. She thought often, during that stretch, of her father, of the specific kind of steady, unglamorous competence he had modeled for her throughout her whole life, showing up every day, doing the quiet work no one else wanted to do, never once demanding recognition for it, but also never once allowing himself to be pushed aside by people who assumed his steadiness meant he would notice being pushed. She realized, sitting with the accountant's final summary one evening, that she had spent over a decade being exactly that kind of steady for other people's benefit, and that the version of herself capable of building this case, carefully and completely, had been in her the entire time, simply waiting for a reason large enough to bring it back to the surface. The final piece of the picture arrived through Denise's office rather than through Rachel's own review, a detail that emerged when the forensic accountant, working through the timeline of the 2 restructuring filings, found an email thread inadvertently included in a batch of documents Preston's attorney had turned over during an earlier, unrelated dispute with a supplier years before. A thread that had simply never been deleted from the shared company server Rachel still technically had access to as part of her bookkeeping role. In it, Thomas told Preston plainly, in language that left very little room for another interpretation, that he intended to leave the marriage once the business was properly protected, expressing a version of guilt about the timing that had far more to do with legal exposure than with Rachel's feelings, and asking Preston to help make sure nothing in the ownership structure could later be characterized as marital property subject to division. Preston's reply was warm, familiar, entirely unbothered, the tone of a lifelong friend helping another lifelong friend handle an inconvenient logistical problem, with no apparent thought given to the 11 years Rachel had spent managing the books that made both of their comfortable lives possible in the first place. Rachel read that email thread twice before she could bring herself to close the laptop, sitting in the same kitchen where she had once planned her father's funeral almost entirely alone, while everyone around her found reasons to be less present than she was. What struck her hardest was not the confirmation of the affair itself, which she had already accepted as true weeks earlier, but the casual, administrative tone of the conversation, the sense that her entire marriage, her role in the business, her financial security, had been discussed between the two of them as a logistical problem to be solved rather than a person's life to be considered. She thought of every dinner Thomas had come home late from over the past year, every closed office door, every moment she had quietly absorbed as ordinary marital drift rather than what it had actually been, a careful, deliberate campaign to reduce her to something that could be managed around rather than someone who needed to be included. Denise laid out Rachel's options with the same plain clarity she had used from their very first coffee together months earlier. The restructuring documents, combined with the email thread and the pattern of diverted consulting payments, gave Rachel considerably more legal standing than Thomas or Preston likely believed she had, standing that could be used to challenge the ownership adjustments directly. To pursue her full and fair share of a business she had spent 11 years helping to build regardless of how carefully its paperwork had been rearranged in the preceding year. Rachel listened to every option without interrupting, the same discipline she brought to closing out a set of books at the end of a long quarter, and when Denise finished, she said only that she wanted to move forward with all of it, not out of anger, though the anger was real, and she no longer felt any need to hide it from herself, but out of a plain, settled refusal to let herself be quietly written out of her own life a second longer than necessary. For those of you who typed 2 earlier, you already have a sense of what Rachel chose, and we will get to whether that patience served her the way she hoped it would. For those of you who typed 1, keep watching, because what Rachel found once she stopped herself from confronting Thomas at that stoplight goes considerably further than most people expect at this point in the story. Rachel scheduled the conversation for a Sunday morning when the workshop would be empty and Thomas would have no reason to suspect anything beyond an ordinary weekend errand when she asked him to meet her there instead of at home. She did not tell him why. She had spent the better part of 2 months learning to hold things quietly, and she held this the same way, Arriving early with Denise waiting in the parking lot in a separate car, a plan the two of them had discussed carefully in advance, Denise present only if Rachel needed her, standing back otherwise to let Rachel handle the conversation on her own terms. Thomas walked in a little after 9, unhurried, clearly expecting nothing more complicated than a conversation about a client schedule or a household expense, and Rachel watched something shift in his face the moment he saw the folder sitting on the workbench between them, thin enough that he could not have guessed at its contents from the outside. The same way she had once watched him slide a similar folder into a drawer without a second thought for whether she might one day see what was inside it. She did not raise her voice, not because she had planned to hold back, but because raising her voice had simply never been the register her strength lived in, and she saw no reason to borrow one now that didn't belong to her. She laid the documents out one at a time, the first restructuring filing, then the second, then the diverted consulting payments tied to Erica's brother, watching Thomas's expression move from confusion into something more careful as he began to understand how much she actually knew. When she finally set the printed email thread on the table between them, the one where he had written to Preston about protecting the business ahead of leaving her, Thomas did not attempt an explanation the way she had half expected he might. He sat back from the workbench, quiet for a long moment, and said only that he had not expected her to find any of it, a sentence that told Rachel almost everything she still needed to know about how little consideration had gone into what any of this might eventually cost her to discover on her own. What followed over the next several months unfolded with considerably more structure than Rachel had ever needed to bring to any part of her life before, precisely because Denise had helped her prepare for nearly every version of it in advance. The divorce filing went forward within 2 weeks of the workshop conversation, and because Rachel had spent 11 years personally managing the very books at the center of a dispute, she was able to walk into every negotiation with a clarity about the company's true financial position that neither Thomas nor Preston's attorney could easily challenge. Denise argued successfully that the 2 restructuring filings, made within a year of an email thread explicitly discussing protecting assets ahead of a planned separation, constituted a deliberate attempt to shield marital property, and the court ultimately restored Rachel's claim to a fair share of the business's value as though the restructuring had never taken place at all. An outcome Denise described afterward as one of the cleaner results she had secured in a case like this in years, owing almost entirely to how thoroughly Rachel had documented everything herself before an attorney had ever been formally retained. Preston's consulting arrangement with Erica's brother came under separate scrutiny once the forensic accountant's findings were shared with the workshop's other business partner obligations, and though no criminal charges ultimately followed, the arrangement was unwound as part of the broader settlement, with Preston agreeing to repay the diverted marketing funds directly rather than risk a more public dispute over misuse of company resources. The friendship between Thomas and Preston, forged over a lifetime that stretched back to childhood, did not survive the process intact, strained not by the affair itself, which Preston had merely enabled rather than participated in directly, but by the plain fact that Preston's help protecting Thomas had ended up costing the company real money and real credibility with several long-time clients who eventually heard some version of what had happened through the small, tightly connected community of tradespeople and clients the workshop had served for years. Rachel did not stay involved in Hartman and Voss Custom Furniture after the settlement concluded, a decision she considered carefully rather than one born out of any lingering resentment toward the physical business itself. She had spent 11 years loving the actual craft of the place, the smell of sawdust in the mornings, the pride in Thomas's voice the first time he showed her a piece he had built by hand, and she did not want the rest of her working life defined by proximity to a company that had also become the site of the worst betrayal she had ever experienced. Instead, she used a portion of her settlement to open a small bookkeeping and financial consulting practice of her own, working primarily with other small tradespeople and family businesses across the same region, a decision that let her keep the exact skills she had spent over a decade building while finally putting her own name, rather than someone else's business, at the center of the work. In the weeks after the workshop conversation, one memory returned to Rachel more often than any other, a moment from early in her marriage she had never once thought twice about at the time, and now found herself replaying with an entirely different meaning attached to it. It was from their 3rd year together, Not long after Walter Hartman passed away, when Thomas had suggested that all of the company's official filings and bank authorizations run through his and Preston's names alone, arguing that it would simplify the paperwork and speed up decisions during a period when the business was growing quickly and every delay cost them a little momentum. Rachel had agreed without much resistance at the time, glad to remove one more administrative burden from her plate during a season when she was still learning the bookkeeping role from scratch, and she had never once revisited that decision in the 8 years since, because nothing had ever given her reason to. Sitting with Denise's documents spread across her kitchen table months into the investigation, Rachel recognized that single early arrangement, made so reasonably and so early, as the exact structural gap that had eventually made the restructuring filings possible to execute without her knowledge or consent. She did not know, and would likely never know for certain, whether Thomas had suggested that arrangement with any foresight of how it might one day be used against her, or whether it had simply become useful to him years later once the opportunity to use it presented itself. She let the question go eventually, deciding that some answers mattered less to her than the outcome she was already working to secure for herself. Rachel told her mother about the divorce on a Thursday afternoon, driving out to the small house where she had grown up, the same kitchen table where her father used to sit doing crossword puzzles every evening after dinner. Her mother listened to the entire account without interrupting, the same quiet attentiveness Rachel recognized in herself, and when Rachel finished, she did not ask why it had taken her so many months to act, a question a few other people in her life would ask her in the months that followed, sometimes gently and sometimes less so. She asked instead whether Rachel felt like herself again, a question that caught Rachel off guard with how directly it named something she had not yet fully put into words for herself. When Rachel admitted that she was only starting to, that some mornings still felt heavier than others, but that she no longer felt invisible inside her own life the way she had for years before any of this began, her mother reached across the table and held her hand the way she used to when Rachel was small, and told her that her father would have been prouder of exactly that answer than of almost anything else in the whole story. Rachel's relationship with her two brothers shifted in an unexpected way over that same period, though not immediately and not without some friction first. Both of them had been largely absent during their father's illness, one living out of state with a demanding job he used as a constant explanation for his distance, the other closer by but reliably unavailable whenever the harder parts of caregiving needed doing, and Rachel had carried a quiet resentment toward both of them for months, without ever saying so directly. When she told them about the divorce and the investigation behind it, her older brother, David, surprised her by driving down the same weekend, sitting with her at the kitchen table for hours listening to details he had never once asked about during their father's illness, and admitting, without much prompting, that he had let Rachel carry too much for too long in both situations because it had simply been easier to let her keep managing things than to show up and share the weight of it himself. It was not a complete repair of everything that had gone unspoken between them for years, but it was, Rachel felt, an honest enough start that she found herself willing to let the resentment soften rather than harden further, choosing to spend her limited energy on rebuilding what still seemed worth rebuilding rather than nursing every grievance she was entitled to hold on to. Throughout the entire process, Rachel leaned on one close friend outside the situation entirely, a woman named Kathleen Ferris she had known since college, who lived 2 hours away and had no connection to Hartman and Voss, to Thomas or Preston, or to anyone else involved. The two of them spoke most Sunday evenings, a standing call that predated any of this by years, and Rachel used those calls during the investigation as the one place where she let the full weight of everything surface without needing to manage it for anyone else's comfort. She never gave Kathleen every specific detail of the restructuring filings or the email thread, careful even there to protect the integrity of what Denise was helping her build, but she told her enough that her marriage was very likely ending, that she had spent months quietly gathering proof of exactly how thoroughly she had been pushed to the margins of her own life, and that she needed somewhere to say all of it out loud without immediately being asked what she planned to do about it. Kathleen mostly listened during those calls, offering steady, uncomplicated support rather than advice she had no basis to give, and Rachel credited those Sunday evenings, more than once in later years, With being the reason, she made it through months of quiet preparation without the weight of it eventually breaking through the composure she needed to hold in front of everyone else. The formal negotiations over the business valuation stretched across several months, longer than Rachel had initially hoped, though Denise had warned her from the outset that disputes involving restructured ownership shares rarely resolved quickly, since both sides needed independent appraisals of the company's worth before any fair settlement could be calculated. Denise remained one of the few people who ever heard the entire story in complete, unfiltered detail, every document, every date, every small, humiliating detail Rachel had otherwise learned to summarize more gently for the rest of the people in her life. And there was something Rachel valued deeply in having at least one relationship where she never had to soften any part of it for someone else's comfort. Rachel sat for a deposition midway through that process, answering questions from Thomas's attorney for nearly 3 hours about her own role in discovering the restructuring filings, a line of questioning clearly intended to suggest she had somehow overstepped her position by reviewing company paperwork she was not specifically asked to review, despite having handled every other piece of that same paperwork for 11 consecutive years without any objection from either partner. Rachel answered every question calmly, without her voice rising or her composure slipping, explaining plainly that she had built the company's entire bookkeeping system from the ground up and had every reasonable basis to notice when new filings appeared that fell outside the pattern of everything she had managed for over a decade. Thomas's attorney did not have a strong follow-up to that particular answer, and the deposition concluded not long afterward. Preston's own deposition, which Rachel was not present for but which Denise summarized for her afterward, apparently included several attempts to characterize the consulting arrangement with Erica's brother as a legitimate marketing expense that had simply been poorly documented rather than deliberately structured to divert funds, an explanation that collapsed once Denise's team walked through the complete absence of any actual marketing deliverables tied to the invoices across an entire year of payments. Denise told Rachel afterward, with something close to genuine satisfaction in her voice, that watching a lifelong smooth talker like Preston struggle to explain himself under oath, without the benefit of his usual easy charm to carry the moment, had been one of the more instructive afternoons she'd had in a case like this in quite some time. The eventual settlement restored Rachel's full and fair share of the business's value as calculated before either restructuring filing had taken place, a considerably better outcome than she had allowed herself to expect on the harder nights of the process, when the sheer scale of what she was up against had occasionally felt too large to move through cleanly. One of the first clients Rachel took on once she opened her own consulting practice was a small landscaping company run by a woman named Monica Reyes, who had inherited the business from her own father 2 years earlier and was struggling to untangle years of informal bookkeeping her father had kept largely in his head rather than on paper. Rachel recognized something of her own recent history in Monica's situation, a woman trying to hold together a business and a grief process at the same time, and she spent considerably more unpaid hours than she billed for in those first few months, walking Monica through a complete overhaul of her invoicing and payroll systems with the same patient thoroughness she had once brought to Hartman and Voss during its own early years of growth. Monica told her, near the end of that first engagement, that she had never once felt like Rachel was simply managing her business for her, the way she suspected a less careful consultant might, but that Rachel seemed genuinely invested in making sure Monica herself understood every part of the system well enough to run it confidently on her own going forward. Rachel thought about that comment more than once in the following months, recognizing in it something close to the exact thing she had wanted for herself for years without ever having the language to ask for it, to be trusted not just to manage things quietly in the background but to be seen clearly for the competence she brought to every part of her work. Rachel's consulting practice grew steadily over the following 2 years, eventually supporting 6 regular clients across small trades and family businesses throughout the region, each relationship built on the same principle she had settled into with Monica: transparency and genuine partnership rather than quiet, invisible management. She hired her first part-time assistant in the 2nd year, a recent accounting graduate named Priya Nair, who reminded Rachel a little of herself at 22, eager and sharp with numbers, but still learning how much of her own voice she was allowed to bring into a room full of business owners who had been running things their own way for years. Rachel made a point in training Priya of insisting on exactly the opposite of what she herself had absorbed over a decade at Hartman and Voss, that being good at the quiet, careful work behind a business did not mean accepting a permanently quiet, background role within it, that competence deserved a seat at the table rather than simply a desk near it. The divorce itself was finalized on an ordinary Wednesday morning roughly 7 months after the workshop conversation, a brief hearing that moved quickly given how thoroughly the financial terms had already been settled between the attorneys in the months leading up to it. Rachel stood outside the courthouse afterward for a few minutes before driving to meet a client, watching the late morning traffic move along the street the way she might once have watched invoices settle into a completed ledger, and she found herself thinking not primarily of Thomas, but of her father, of how strange it felt that the two biggest losses of her adult year had arrived so close together. One grief chosen for her by illness and one grief she had, in the end, chosen for herself once. She understood clearly enough what she was actually looking at. She allowed herself perhaps 15 minutes of that particular feeling, standing in a courthouse parking lot on an ordinary Wednesday, before checking the time and remembering that Monica Reyes was expecting her at noon to go over the landscaping company's quarterly numbers, and there was, she found, a specific kind of relief in having somewhere concrete and useful to be immediately afterward. A business that needed her clear thinking regardless of what had just happened in a courtroom a few blocks away. Thomas moved out of state within the year, taking a position managing operations for a larger furniture manufacturer several states away, a move Rachel heard about secondhand through a mutual acquaintance rather than from Thomas directly, since the two of them had stopped speaking beyond what the settlement required almost immediately after the divorce was finalized. Preston kept Hartman and Voss running under his own name alone, though Rachel heard, again secondhand, that the workshop had lost at least 2 of its longtime clients within the first year after word of the settlement, and the underlying reasons behind it spread through the same small, tightly connected community of tradespeople the business had served for years. Rachel felt no particular satisfaction hearing any of this, and she was careful, when the subject came up among mutual friends who seemed almost eager to share updates as though doing her a favor, not to indulge in it the way some of them clearly expected her to, telling most of them plainly that she had built an entire new professional life that had nothing to do with either man and would prefer to keep the conversation there going forward. It took Rachel nearly 2 years before she considered dating again, and when she finally did, she noticed herself approaching new relationships with a kind of deliberate slowness she had never needed before any of this happened, not from bitterness, which she worked hard not to let settle permanently into her outlook, but from a clear-eyed understanding of how easily a person could disappear into someone else's version of a shared life without ever quite noticing it happening. She built new habits into her personal finances the same way she had once helped Monica Reyes rebuild an entire bookkeeping system from scratch, keeping her own accounts fully in her own name, maintaining her own retirement savings independent of any future partner. Decisions that had less to do with distrust of any specific person she might one day let into her life and more to do with never again allowing herself to become financially unknowable even to herself the way she had been for years. Inside her marriage to Thomas, she dated occasionally over those 2 years, nothing serious enough to reshape her life again just yet, and she found she did not mind the slower pace nearly as much as she had once assumed she would, discovering instead a kind of settled contentment in a life that was, for the first time in over a decade, unmistakably and entirely her own. Erica Doyle left Hartman and Voss not long after the settlement concluded, moving to a different city according to the same second-hand channels of mutual acquaintances that kept Rachel loosely informed of developments she no longer had much emotional stake in. Rachel thought about her only rarely in the years that followed, and when she did, it was less with anger than with a kind of distant, complicated curiosity about what Erica had actually believed she was building with Thomas, whether she had known about the restructuring filings and the plan to leave Rachel once the business was protected, or whether she too had simply been managed carefully around, the way Rachel herself had been for years, by 2 men considerably more practiced at protecting their own interests than either of the women in their lives had perhaps fully understood at the time. Rachel never found out the answer to that question, and eventually she let it go the same way she had let go of so many other loose threads from that year, deciding that some answers mattered less to her healing than the life she was actively building in their place. What stayed with Rachel longest, more than the settlement or the courthouse hearing or even the quiet satisfaction of watching her own consulting practice grow client by client, was the strange, layered way her grief for her father and her reckoning with her marriage had ended up braided together in her memory of that entire year. She had buried him in March and, in a sense, had spent the following months slowly excavating a different kind of loss, the loss of a version of herself she had allowed to go quiet for the better part of a decade, mistaking her own steadiness for something that needed no attention or protection of its own. She thought often about the specific kind of competence her father had modeled for her throughout her whole life, the patience of a man who did the necessary work without ever demanding recognition for it, and she came to understand, somewhere in the second year after the divorce, that she had spent years extending that same patient competence toward people who had stopped extending anything comparable back to her, mistaking her own capacity to endure for a reasonable substitute for actually being seen. She remembered, in particular, a conversation with her father from several years before his illness, one she had not thought about in a long time until it resurfaced almost fully formed one evening while she was closing out Monica Reyes's quarterly books. He had asked her, during a quiet dinner the two of them shared not long after Walter Hartman passed away, whether she was happy with how much of the business rested on her shoulders without her name attached to any of the credit for it, and she remembered brushing the question aside at the time, telling him she didn't need her name on anything as long as the work got done and the people she loved were taken care of. Her father had not pushed the point further that evening, but she remembered the particular look on his face, something between concern and a kind of patient waiting, as though he suspected she might need to arrive at a different answer to that same question on her own, in her own time, and was choosing not to rush her toward it. Sitting with that memory years later, Rachel understood it as one of the last quiet gifts her father had given her, the simple act of asking a hard question and then trusting her enough not to answer it for her. Kathleen Ferris remained one of Rachel's closest friends throughout all of it, and the two of them kept their standing Sunday call going long after the divorce concluded, the conversations gradually shifting from crisis support back into the easier, lighter territory old friendships eventually returned to once the hardest parts have passed. On one particular Sunday, nearly 3 years after the workshop conversation, Kathleen asked Rachel, almost offhandedly, whether she ever regretted waiting as long as she had before confronting Thomas that first year, rather than acting the moment she noticed the phone at the stoplight. Rachel considered the question seriously before answering, the same careful consideration she brought to every decision that actually mattered to her, and told Kathleen that she didn't, not because the waiting had been easy, but because the version of herself capable of building an entire case methodically, the way her father had taught her to build anything worth building, had turned out to be exactly the version of herself she needed to meet in order to walk out of that year with her own name, her own business, and her own sense of herself fully intact. There was a night, midway through her quiet review of the company's records, when Thomas came downstairs unexpectedly while Rachel sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, restructuring documents visible on the screen in front of her. Her heart went still in a way it rarely did even during the hardest weeks of her father's illness, certain for one long moment that months of careful, private work were about to end in a conversation she was not yet ready to have. Thomas glanced at the laptop only long enough to ask if she was still working on invoices, and when she told him she was catching up on a few things before bed, he nodded, poured himself a glass of water, and went back upstairs without looking closely enough to recognize what was actually on the screen. Rachel sat with her hands flat on the table for several minutes afterward before she could bring herself to keep working, understanding in that moment exactly how much her entire plan depended on being underestimated by two men who had spent years assuming her attention would always be pointed somewhere other than at them. Priya Nair, the young assistant Rachel eventually hired for her consulting practice, became in some ways the clearest measure of how much Rachel had changed by the time she was training someone else in the work. In her first few months, Priya had a habit of deferring almost automatically to the business owners they worked with, apologizing before offering an observation, softening every correction into a question rather than a statement, and Rachel recognized the pattern immediately because she had lived inside a version of it herself for over a decade. She made a point of pulling Priya aside after client meetings to name the pattern directly, not unkindly but clearly, telling her that being right about a set of numbers did not require an apology attached to it, that the softest voice in the room was not automatically the one that needed to defer to everyone else's comfort. Priya took the feedback seriously, and within a year, Rachel noticed a genuine shift in how she carried herself in front of clients, speaking plainly, holding her ground on a figure she had checked twice, and Rachel found a particular kind of quiet pride in watching someone else arrive at a version of confidence it had taken her considerably longer, and at a much higher cost, to reach for herself. The independent appraisal of Hartman and Voss, ordered as part of the settlement negotiations, took nearly 4 months to complete, longer than Rachel had hoped, since the appraiser needed to reconstruct an accurate picture of the company's value both before and after the 2 restructuring filings in order to establish exactly how much the adjustments had shifted in Preston's favor at Rachel's expense. Rachel sat through 2 lengthy meetings with the appraiser herself, providing years of financial records she still had access to from her time managing the books, records considerably more detailed and better organized than anything Thomas or Preston's side of the case was able to produce on short notice. A fact Denise pointed out more than once as one of the quieter advantages Rachel brought to the entire process simply by being the person who had actually done the careful work of running the company for over a decade. The appraiser's final report concluded that the restructuring filings had shifted nearly 40% of the company's effective ownership value away from what would otherwise have been considered part of the marital estate, a figure that, once confirmed, gave Denise the clear legal footing she needed to argue for Rachel's full and fair share in the eventual settlement. Rachel remembered sitting in Denise's office the afternoon that appraisal report finally arrived, reading through the numbers slowly, the same unhurried, careful reading she brought to every important document in her life, and feeling something settle in her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as something closer to vindication than relief. It was not the number itself that mattered most to her, though the number was significant enough to secure her financial footing for years to come. It was the simple fact, laid out in a formal document prepared by someone with no personal stake in either side of the story, that what she had suspected sitting alone at her kitchen table months earlier, that she had been deliberately and systematically pushed to the margins of something she had spent over a decade helping to build, was not an exaggeration born out of grief or hurt feelings, but a documented, quantifiable truth that no one on the other side of the table could argue away. On the 2nd anniversary of her father's death, Rachel drove out to the cemetery on the edge of town where he was buried, the same visit she had made every year since the funeral, though this particular visit felt different from the ones before it. She stood at the plain granite marker for a long while, the late afternoon light slanting low across the grass the way it had on the day of the funeral itself, and she found herself telling him, quietly, the way she sometimes still did in moments like this, about the consulting practice, about Monica Reyes and Priya Nair, about the settlement and the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding an entire professional identity almost from scratch in her mid-30s. She did not tell him she wished the entire ordeal with Thomas and Preston had never happened, because she was no longer certain that was fully true anymore. She had lost a marriage and a version of a life she once assumed she would keep indefinitely, but she had also, in the same stretch of time, found her way back to a version of herself she suspected her father had always been quietly waiting for her to rediscover on her own terms. She thought, standing there, of the specific phrase her mother had used months earlier, asking whether Rachel felt like herself again, and she understood now, with a clarity that had taken the better part of 2 years to arrive at fully, that the woman standing at that grave was not simply the same Rachel from before her marriage restored to her earlier shape, but someone new entirely, forged out of grief and vindication arriving at nearly the same time, someone who had learned, at considerable cost, exactly what it took to stop disappearing quietly into other people's convenience and start building something unmistakably her own. She left the cemetery that evening the way she always did, unhurried, steady, carrying the particular kind of quiet her father had modeled for her throughout her entire life, except that this time, for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, the quiet felt entirely like her own choice rather than a role she had simply grown into without noticing. The apartment Rachel moved into after the divorce sat on the second floor of a converted warehouse not far from downtown, smaller than the house she and Thomas had shared for most of their marriage, but entirely her own in a way that house had never quite managed to be despite 11 years of her life spent inside it. She furnished it slowly over the following year, choosing pieces one at a time rather than filling the space all at once, and she found herself drawn, without entirely meaning to, towards simple, well-made furniture, a solid oak dining table from a small maker 2 towns over, a reading chair with joinery visible enough that she found herself running her thumb along the seams the way Thomas once had on the chest of drawers he built her all those years earlier. She did not consider this a deliberate irony, exactly, though she recognized it as one eventually, that the thing she had loved most genuinely about her old life, the quiet integrity of well-built, honest work, was the one part of it she had carried forward entirely intact, simply attached now to her own home rather than someone else's business. She kept a small home office in the second bedroom, where she did the bulk of her consulting work for Monica Reyes and her other growing roster of clients, and she made a point, setting it up, of hanging her own name on the door in simple lettering she'd had made at a local print shop, Rachel Hartman Consulting. A small gesture that would have seemed unnecessary to her years earlier, and now felt like one of the more meaningful choices she had made in the entire process of rebuilding her life. Clients who visited that office for the first time sometimes commented on how organized and precise everything looked, invoices filed by month, tax records cross-referenced and easy to locate, and Rachel would tell them, when the moment felt right, that she had spent over a decade building exactly this kind of system for someone else's business before she ever built one for her own, and that the second version, however much smaller in scale, mattered to her considerably more. Monica Reyes referred 3 new clients to Rachel over the following 2 years, each one a small business owner navigating some version of the same tangled, informal bookkeeping Monica herself had inherited, and each referral arrived with some variation of the same compliment, that Rachel was the rare kind of consultant who made a business owner feel more capable rather than more dependent by the time an engagement ended. Rachel took particular care with a client named Harold Whitby, an older man who ran a small furniture restoration shop not far from where Hartman and Voss still operated under Preston's name, a coincidence that struck Rachel the first time Harold mentioned it, but that she found she could sit with more easily than she might have expected a year or 2 earlier. Harold reminded her a little of her own father, careful with his hands and quiet about his own competence, and working with him over several months felt, in its own way, like a small continuation of the kind of steady, useful presence she had always wanted to be for the people in her life, now finally offered on terms she had chosen for herself rather than absorbed by default. Denise Callahan remained a close friend long after the legal proceedings concluded, the working relationship between attorney and client gradually softening into something more personal, the two of them meeting for dinner every few months to catch up on nothing more consequential than ordinary life, a shift Rachel appreciated more than she generally let herself acknowledge out loud. It was Denise who eventually convinced Rachel, nearly 3 years after the divorce, to share a shortened version of her story publicly for the first time at a small networking event for women who had started their own consulting or trade businesses after a major life transition, an audience Rachel found unexpectedly moving to speak in front of, several women in the room nodding along with a specific kind of recognition that told her clearly she was not the only person who had once mistaken her own quiet competence for something that needed no protection of its own. Standing in front of that room, Rachel found herself telling the story in a way she had never quite put into words before, not as a betrayal narrative centered on Thomas and Preston, but as a slower, more private story about the specific danger of being so reliably steady that the people around her simply stopped checking whether she was still standing on solid ground herself. She told them about her father, about the crossword puzzles, and the quiet question he had once asked her over dinner about whether she was happy with how invisible her contributions to the business had become, and she watched several women in the audience react to that particular detail more visibly than to anything else in the story, a recognition that told her this was the part that actually mattered most. More than the restructuring filings or the settlement figures, the simple, universal experience of disappearing gradually into a role no one thought to ask if she still wanted. After the event, a woman Rachel didn't know approached her in the parking lot, thanking her quietly for sharing what she had, admitting that she recognized pieces of her own marriage in almost every part of Rachel's story and had never had language for it until that evening. Rachel drove home that night thinking less about the specifics of her own year with Thomas and Preston than about how many women, in how many different versions of the same quiet arrangement, were likely sitting in similar kitchens at that exact moment, absorbing the same slow erosion Rachel herself had once mistaken for the ordinary shape of a settled life. She did not think of herself as someone with a message to spread, exactly, but she understood, driving home that night, that the version of her story worth telling was never really about Thomas or Preston at all. It was about the moment a person decides, however late, however quietly, that her own steadiness deserves the exact same protection she has always been so willing to offer everyone else. Rachel thought, in the years that followed, about how differently the entire story might have unfolded if she had confronted Thomas the moment she noticed that first phone screen light up at the stoplight, the version of events she imagined sometimes late at night, wondering whether a faster reaction might have spared her some of the harder months that came afterward, the depositions, the long wait for the appraisal, the specific ache of sitting across a workshop table from a man she had loved for over a decade while laying out proof of exactly how little he had come to value her. She did not believe, in the end, that the faster version would have served her better, mostly because she understood, with the clarity only distance provides, that a confrontation born out of raw hurt in that first unsettled month would have given Thomas and Preston every opportunity to control the narrative, to frame her discovery as an overreaction rather than what it actually was. A woman finally noticing something she had every right to notice years earlier. The patience had cost her something real, months of quiet, difficult waiting layered directly on top of grief she had barely begun to process. But it had also given her the one thing she needed most by the time it was finally over, an outcome built entirely on documented fact rather than on whatever version of events two more practiced, more comfortable people might have constructed in the moment if she had given them the chance. What Rachel came to understand, more than anything else, was that the quiet competence her father had modeled for her throughout her whole life, the discipline of doing the necessary work carefully and without complaint, had never actually been the problem. The problem had been forgetting, for the better part of a decade, that the same discipline was allowed to protect her own interests just as thoroughly as it had always protected everyone else's. She carried that lesson forward into every part of the life she rebuilt afterward, into her consulting practice, into the careful boundaries she set with new relationships, into the simple, deliberate choice to put her own name on her own office door rather than letting her competence disappear quietly into someone else's success one more time. It was not a lesson she would have chosen to learn at the cost of a marriage and the worst year of grief she had ever known. But it was, she eventually decided, the truest gift that terrible year had ultimately given her, the return of a version of herself she had not realized until she found her way back to it, how completely she had let herself lose. There was one more conversation Rachel had, nearly 4 years after the divorce, that she found herself returning to often afterward, a chance meeting with Curtis Boyd, an old craftsman who had worked at Hartman and Voss since Walter Hartman's earliest years running the shop, and who she ran into at a hardware supply store she still occasionally visited out of habit from her years managing the workshop's material orders. Curtis had retired not long after Preston took over the business alone, and he told Rachel plainly, standing in the aisle between them, that the shop had never quite recovered its old rhythm after everything came out, that too many of the longtime clients who had once trusted the place implicitly seemed to carry a quiet wariness now that hadn't existed before, a wariness Curtis attributed less to the affair itself, which most people eventually forgave or forgot, and more to the plain fact that two men who had built their whole reputation on careful, honest craftsmanship had turned out to be considerably less careful and considerably less honest than anyone assumed once real money and a marriage were on the line. Rachel listened without much visible reaction, the same composed stillness she had carried through the entire ordeal years earlier, but she thought about that conversation for days afterward, recognizing in it a kind of validation she had not expected to need any longer by that point in her life, proof that the version of events she had lived through privately for so long was not simply her own account of things, but something other people who had watched from the outside had come to recognize clearly as well. Curtis asked her, near the end of that conversation, whether she ever regretted leaving the workshop entirely rather than fighting to stay involved in some capacity, given how much of her own younger years she had poured into building it alongside Thomas and Walter. Rachel told him honestly that she didn't, that the workshop had been Walter's dream first and Thomas and Preston's inheritance of it second, and that her own name had never truly been part of what that particular business represented, however many years of careful work she had quietly put into keeping it running. What she had built afterward, however much smaller in scale, carried her own name plainly on the door, and that difference, she told Curtis, mattered to her more than any amount of continued involvement in a business that had, in the end, revealed exactly how replaceable it had always considered her to be. On the 5th anniversary of the workshop conversation, the same Sunday morning meeting where she had laid out the restructuring filings and the email thread across a workbench Thomas had once used to measure custom commissions, Rachel sat at her own kitchen table in her own apartment, reviewing a set of quarterly numbers for a new client, a small bakery 2 towns over run by a young couple navigating their first year in business together. She noticed, going through their invoicing system, a small discrepancy in a supplier account that didn't quite match the pattern of everything else. Nothing dramatic, simply a number that sat 1 degree outside where it should have been, and she found herself smiling faintly at her own reflex, the same careful attention to a single strange reading that had once, years earlier, unraveled an entire hidden life she had never known she was living alongside. She flagged the discrepancy for the couple the following morning, along with a note explaining exactly what to look for if it happened again, the same kind of transparent, empowering guidance she had built her entire practice around, and she thought, closing her laptop that evening, that the version of herself capable of noticing that one small number out of place was not a wound she carried forward from the worst year of her life, but a skill, hard-won and now fully her own, that she intended to keep using for exactly as long as anyone needed her steady, careful attention pointed in their direction. Rachel kept one small memento from her old life displayed in her new home office, a single dovetail joint Thomas had cut and given her early in their marriage as a kind of practice piece he'd been especially proud of, small enough to fit in her palm, the wood grain matched so precisely along the seam that even after everything, she could not deny it represented genuine skill and genuine care at the time it was made. She had gone back and forth for a long while about whether keeping it made any sense at all, whether it was a strange kind of loyalty to a version of Thomas that had, in some sense, stopped existing well before she ever discovered the restructuring filings. She eventually decided to keep it, not as a tribute to the marriage itself, but as a reminder of a simpler truth she wanted close at hand on difficult days, that a person could be genuinely skilled, genuinely capable of real tenderness in one part of their life, and still make devastating, self-serving choices in another part of it, and that recognizing both of those things about someone at once, rather than needing the story to resolve into a single simple villain, was part of what it meant to actually understand what had happened to her rather than simply survive it. Her father, she thought often in later years, would have appreciated that particular kind of clear-eyed honesty more than almost anything else about how she chose to carry the story forward. He had never been a man who dealt in simple villains either, always more interested in understanding exactly how a problem had actually come together than in assigning blame quickly and moving on, and Rachel recognized, the longer she sat with everything that had happened, that this too was something of as she had carried forward into her own adult life without ever quite noticing where the habit had come from. She did not need Thomas to be a monster in order to justify everything she had done to protect herself once she understood what he and Preston had built quietly around her. She only needed to be honest about what had actually happened, clearly enough and completely enough that she never again had to wonder, on some quiet night years later, whether she had imagined the whole thing, or made more of it than it truly was. She hadn't. The document said so. Her own steady, careful attention had said so months before any document ever confirmed it. And that, in the end, was the version of the story she chose to keep closest, not the anger, not even the vindication exactly, but the plain, Settled knowledge that she had trusted her own quiet instincts completely and that they had, in the end, been exactly right. Denise told her once, over one of their regular dinners years after the case had closed, that of all the clients she had represented in similar situations, Rachel remained one of the few who had walked away from the entire process without a visible hardness settling permanently into how she talked about it, still capable of naming what Thomas had done plainly, without flinching, but also still capable of speaking about the good years of her marriage without needing to erase them or pretend they had never been real simply because of how everything eventually ended. Rachel told her that she didn't think of it as some special strength on her part, only as a natural extension of the same discipline that had gotten her through the entire investigation in the first place, the refusal to let any single feeling, however large, override her clear-eyed view of the whole picture. She had grieved her father honestly. She had grieved her marriage honestly. And she had built something new for herself just as honestly, refusing every temptation along the way to simplify any part of the story into something smaller and easier to carry than the truth actually was. It was, she came to believe, the last and most important lesson her father had ever taught her, delivered not through any single conversation but through an entire lifetime of quiet example, that the truth, however complicated, however layered with both real love and real betrayal at once, was always sturdier ground to stand on than any simpler version a person might be tempted to settle for instead. Rachel built the rest of her life on that ground, one careful, honest client relationship at a time, one quiet Sunday phone call with Kathleen at a time, one dovetail joint kept on a shelf not as a wound but as a reminder, and she found, in the years that followed, that sturdy ground was worth considerably more than the smaller, softer version of her old life she had once mistaken for something worth protecting at any cost. So we want to ask you directly, now that you have heard the whole story, because the answer says as much about the person watching as it does about the one living through it. If you typed one earlier and said you would have confronted Thomas the moment you saw that phone light up at the stoplight, do you still feel that way now that you know everything Rachel uncovered by waiting, or has the story, and everything it eventually cost her to stay quiet that long, changed your answer? And if you typed 2 and said you would have done exactly what Rachel did, we want to know what part of her patience surprised you the most, whether it was the 2 months of quiet documentation, the decision to keep working alongside Thomas every single day without letting anything show, or the calm way she finally laid it all out on that workbench once she was ready. Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one of them, and we always want to hear which side of that decision you land on once you have the full picture in front of you, because we have noticed that the answer people give at the start of a story like this one is very rarely the same answer they give once they understand everything that patience actually uncovered. If this story kept you watching until the very end, wait until you hear what happened to a woman in Charleston, South Carolina, who thought she had finally found the one mother-in-law who would never keep a secret from her, and what she found locked inside an old cedar chest 2 years into that marriage. That story is coming very soon, so make sure you are subscribed and have your notifications turned on so you never miss it, because these stories only get harder to look away from the further you get into them. Thank you for spending this time with us today. Thank you for staying with Rachel's story all the way to the end, and we will see you in the next one.